Coconut frond snapped somewhere beyond the sandbar, and Private First Class Johnny Schmid heard it before he saw anything. A low rustle, like wind dragging through wet brush, except there hadn't been wind for hours. The air over Alligator Creek sat heavy and still at 01:30 on August 21, 1942. Schmid occupied a listening post on the east bank of what the Marines called the Tenaroo River, though it carried neither name correctly on any proper map. His job required one skill, staying quiet enough to hear what moved in the dark. Something moved. A lot of something. Behind Schmid and the thin line of 1st Marine Division riflemen dug into the West Bank, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock had spent the previous 48 hours doing something the Japanese did not expect any American commander to do. He registered his guns, every single one. The 37mm anti-tank weapons, the water-cooled .30 caliber Brownings, the 81mm mortars, Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had pre-plotted fields of fire across that sandbar with the kind of geometric patience that belongs in a surveyor's office, not a jungle. Range cards existed for overlapping sectors. The mortars held coordinates for the far bank, the near bank, the sandbar itself, the tree line 200 yards east. Pollock's Marines had turned that creek crossing into a shooting gallery with no exit. The coconut grove on the Japanese side of the river had been divided into target reference points accurate to the yard. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki did not know this. He commanded roughly 900 men of the Ichiki Detachment, an elite formation built around the 28th Infantry Regiment, veterans of combat in China. Ichiki carried orders to retake Henderson Field, and he carried something more dangerous than orders: contempt. His intelligence assessment of the American garrison relied on assumptions rooted in Japanese experience against colonial troops in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Soft garrisons, poorly led. The notion that a Marine Rifle Battalion had spent 2 days calculating interlocking fires across every inch of a killing ground did not enter his operational planning. What entered his planning instead involved a frontal bayonet charge across a narrow sandbar in the dark. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think that Japanese captain reported that cost him his rank. If you're new here, subscribe and stick through to the end. Hit like when the answer surprises you, because it will. The first wave hit at 01:31. Ichiki's lead elements broke from the coconut grove at a sprint, screaming, bayonets fixed, racing across 30 yards of open sand toward the creek mouth where it met the ocean. Schmid and the other listening post Marines pulled back fast. They had rehearsed this withdrawal, and the defensive line opened up with everything Pollock had registered. The Brownings caught the Japanese in enfilade from 2 directions simultaneously. Tracers cut flat across the sandbar in crossing streams, green and orange lines that bounced off the wet sand and tumbled into the surf. Mortar illumination rounds popped overhead, and for the first time, the Marines could see what they faced. A packed column of soldiers charging directly into the mouth of pre-registered automatic weapons fire at a range where missing required effort. The effect resembled nothing Ichiki's veterans had encountered in China. Defenders there had broken and run. The psychological shock of a massed bayonet assault at night had routed garrison troops across half of Asia. On this sandbar, nobody ran. The Brownings kept firing in disciplined bursts. The 37mm guns, designed to kill tanks, fired canister rounds into the packed infantry at point-blank range, each round spraying the equivalent of a giant shotgun blast across the sand. Bodies stacked at the waterline. A second wave hit. The mortars walked their pre-registered coordinates back into the coconut grove, where reserves gathered, and the detonations among the trees produced a sound one Marine later described as continuous thunder, broken by screaming. Ichiki sent a third wave, then a fourth. Each one crossed the same sandbar, under the same interlocking fires, into the same kill zone that had not shifted by a single degree since the first shot. The Japanese broke small groups across the creek upstream, infiltrating into Marine positions, and close quarters fighting erupted along the west bank. Knife work, entrenching tools, pistols fired into faces at arm's length. But the main crossing stayed sealed. The Brownings never stopped. Their barrels glowed in the dark, and assistant gunners poured water from canteens over the jackets to keep them cycling. By 0300, the sandbar held so many dead that subsequent waves tripped over their own fallen before reaching the creek. Dawn came at 0545, and what it revealed on that sandbar made hardened Marines go quiet. Pollock's defensive geometry had performed exactly as plotted. The range cards, the interlocking sectors, the pre-registered mortar concentrations, the canister-loaded 37s, every piece of that preparation had functioned with mechanical precision against an enemy that kept feeding men into it for 4 straight hours. But what happened next? What a Japanese company captain allegedly reported to his surviving superiors about why the American night defense held so perfectly, carried consequences that reached beyond this beach, beyond Guadalcanal, beyond anything Ichiki lived to see, because Ichiki did not survive this sandbar. And the report his captain filed challenged a foundational belief the Imperial Japanese Army held about Americans as a fighting force. To understand why that report destroyed a career, the story has to back up several thousand miles to the training doctrine that told Japan's soldiers exactly what to expect from the United States Marine Corps at night. The night attack is the peculiar property of the Japanese Army. That line appeared in the 1943 edition of the Imperial Japanese Army's Infantry Manual, but the sentiment predated the manual by decades. It functioned less as tactical guidance than as ethnic theology, a belief that Japanese soldiers possessed a spiritual capacity for close combat in darkness that Western armies, soft and machine-dependent, could never match. The manual did not treat this as opinion. It presented night assault supremacy as a characteristic of the race, something bred into the Japanese fighting man through Bushido and centuries of sword culture, something no amount of American industrial output could neutralize because factories cannot manufacture courage in the dark. That doctrine traced its modern origins to Manchuria in 1931 and 32, where Japanese infantry discovered that Chinese garrison forces collapsed under massed bayonet charges launched between midnight and 0400. The pattern repeated with such reliability that it hardened into axiom. Chinese defenders who fought competently in daylight, returning fire from prepared positions, using terrain, maintaining unit cohesion, simply disintegrated when Japanese assault troops closed to bayonet range at night. Officers fled. Enlisted men threw down rifles. Entire battalions evaporated into the countryside rather than face cold steel in the dark. Japanese after-action reports from the Kwantung Army cataloged this phenomenon with clinical precision, noting that the psychological break typically occurred not at the moment of physical contact, but at the moment the defenders heard the charging scream. The sound alone routed them. By 1933, night bayonet assault had become the default solution in the IJA playbook for breaking any defensive position that resisted daylight approach. Why absorb casualties from machine gun fire across open ground when darkness eliminated the defender's advantage and transferred it wholesale to the attacker willing to close the distance? The doctrine received its most dramatic validation in Malaya, beginning December 1941. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army drove down the Malay Peninsula against British, Australian, and Indian forces in a campaign that lasted 70 days and covered 700 miles. Night attacks featured in nearly every major engagement. At Jitra, on December 11th and 12th, the 5th Division launched a night assault against the 11th Indian Division that produced a rout so complete the British abandoned enough equipment to supply a full Japanese regiment for a week. At Slim River, on January 7, 1942, Japanese tanks and infantry attacked before dawn and shattered 2 Indian brigades in hours, capturing over 3,000 prisoners. The British had artillery. They had automatic weapons. They had prepared positions with wire. None of it mattered once Japanese infantry penetrated the perimeter in darkness and the defenders lost visual contact with their own officers. Singapore fell on February 15th. Yamashita captured over 80,000 Allied troops, the largest surrender in British military history. Japanese training cadres absorbed these results and distilled them into a single operational lesson. Western-trained armies cannot function at night. Their soldiers require visual command links to their officers. They depend on crew-served weapons that lose effectiveness when targets cannot be identified. They panic when the fighting turns personal. Bayonet, sword, grenade at arm's length. Strip away their technological advantages by attacking in darkness, and they revert to frightened individuals incapable of coordinated resistance. This assessment contained a kernel of tactical truth wrapped in a fatal generalization. Colonial defense forces in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies often suffered from poor unit cohesion, inadequate training for close combat, and leadership that crumbled under shock. The IJA observed these failures and attributed them to something inherent in Western soldiers rather than something specific to undertrained garrison troops fighting far from home with shaky morale. The distinction mattered enormously. It meant the difference between a doctrine calibrated to exploit specific enemy weaknesses and a doctrine built on racial mythology that assumed all Western forces shared those weaknesses. Just as Yamashita's staff had generalized from Jitra to all British forces, so too did Imperial General Headquarters generalize from Malaya to all Americans. The logic ran in a straight line. Americans lived in comfort. Their culture prized individual safety over collective sacrifice. Their military relied on machines, tanks, aircraft, artillery that darkness rendered irrelevant. American infantry had never faced a massed bayonet charge. When they did, the result would mirror Jitra and Slim River, and every night action from Manchuria to Singapore. The charging scream would break them. It always broke them. By mid-1942, this conviction saturated every echelon of the IJA officers, graduating from the Rikugun Shikengako, the military academy at Ichigaya, received instruction that specifically identified night attack as the equalizer against American material superiority. Training emphasized speed across open ground, silent approach to within 50 meters, then the explosive rush with fixed bayonets. Soldiers practiced night movement through dense vegetation until they could cover 100 meters in jungle without producing audible sound. The entire system rested on one assumption, so deeply embedded it functioned as gravity. The defenders would break. They always broke. Colonel Ichiki carried this assumption onto the sandbar at Alligator Creek the way he carried his sword, as something fundamental to his identity as a Japanese officer. His plan required no sophistication, because the doctrine told him sophistication against Americans at night amounted to over-engineering. Hit them screaming in the dark, and hit them before they could think. The rest would follow. 800 of his men crossed that sandbar, believing the same thing. What waited for them on the West Bank? Range cards, interlocking Brownings, canister rounds, Marines who did not move, existed outside the boundaries of everything the IJA had taught them to expect. And when a surviving company captain tried to explain that fact to his superiors, he discovered that the doctrine did not accommodate contradiction. Pollock's operations sergeant, a career Marine named Henry Gruenwald, spent the afternoon of August 19th crawling on his belly across the West Bank with a compass and a knotted cord. He measured distances the old way, cords stretched between stakes, knots counted, numbers scratched into a pocket notebook with a pencil stub. Every 25 yards he drove a stake and recorded its bearing from each machine gun position. The process took 7 hours. By the time he finished, Pollock's fire plan existed not as a concept, but as a table of numbers, range, deflection, and traverse limits for every automatic weapon in the battalion, cross-referenced against terrain features that a gunner could identify by touch in total darkness. The creek bank, the sandbar's seaward lip, a fallen palm trunk 40 yards east, a coral outcrop at the waterline. Each one became a firing reference that required no eyes to use. What Ichiki attacked on August 21st amounted to a mathematical surface. Every square meter of that sandbar sat inside the beaten zone of at least 2 weapons, most of them 3. The Browning .30 caliber machine gun, water-cooled, produced a beaten zone roughly 2 meters wide and 20 meters deep at the ranges Pollock's gunners engaged, between 30 and 80 yards. At those distances, the guns operated in what the Marine Corps manual called grazing fire, meaning the bullet stream never rose higher than a standing man's waist across its entire trajectory. A soldier could not duck under it or crawl beneath it. The only way to survive grazing fire from a Browning at 40 yards involved not being on the sandbar when the trigger closed. Pollock positioned his Brownings in pairs, with overlapping fields that created a crossfire pattern the manuals called interlocking bands. Each gun covered the dead space of its partner. A charging soldier who moved laterally to escape one stream ran directly into the other. The geometry left no gap wider than a man's shoulders, anywhere on that sandbar. And that gap existed for roughly 1/5 of a second before the traversing guns swept back across it. The Marines had rehearsed this traverse in daylight, each gunner memorizing the physical stops on his tripod's traversing slide. Turn the crank to the left, stop, fire a burst, reverse to the right, stop, fire a burst. The rhythm became mechanical. Darkness changed nothing because the gunner never aimed at a target. He aimed at a coordinate. Behind the Brownings, Pollock stacked his 81mm mortars in a configuration that turned the coconut grove into a secondary kill zone. Mortar fire works differently than machine gun fire. It drops from above, and its fragmentation radius makes precision less critical than pattern. Pollock's mortar section pre-registered 5 concentrations in the grove, spaced 50 meters apart along the likely assembly routes Ichiki's reserves would use. Each concentration carried a number. When the attack began, the mortar crews dropped rounds on concentration 1, shifted to concentration 2, walked through 3, 4, 5, then reversed the sequence, back and forth, mechanical as a typewriter carriage. They never saw what they hit. They never needed to. The British had tried something comparable at the Somme in 1916. Pre-registered defensive fires on fixed lines, interlocking machine gun positions, pre-plotted artillery concentrations. The difference on the Somme involved scale, terrain, and an attacker who learned from each failure. Ichiki's men faced a compressed version of the same defensive logic across 30 yards of open sand, and they never adapted. The 37mm guns provided the final layer. These weapons existed in the Marine Table of Organization as anti-tank guns, designed to punch through armored plate. Against massed infantry, the crews loaded canister, a tin cylinder packed with steel balls that turned the gun into a 300-yard shotgun. Each canister round contained roughly 122 steel balls. At the ranges on that sandbar, never more than 60 yards, the shot pattern spread to roughly 3 meters wide. One trigger pull swept a corridor through any formation dense enough to fill it. Pollock positioned 2 of these guns with direct line of sight down the length of the sandbar, meaning the canister rounds traveled along the long axis of the Japanese column rather than across it. A single round could strike every man in a file 20 deep. The combined output defies casual arithmetic. Each Browning cycled at 450 rounds per minute. Pollock deployed at least 8 along the creek frontage. The mortars fired roughly 18 rounds per minute per tube, across 4 tubes. The 37mm fired roughly 25 aimed rounds per minute each. In the first 60 seconds of the engagement, the volume of metal crossing that sandbar likely exceeded 3,000 projectiles, across a space roughly 30 meters wide and 80 meters long, 2,400 square meters. More than 1 round per square meter per second, sustained for a full minute before the Japanese lead elements reached the creek bank. Ichiki's training told him the defenders would hear the scream, see the bayonets catch starlight, feel the ancient terror of edged weapons in the dark, and run. His training did not account for defenders who had converted the battlefield into a firing table before the first attacker left the tree line. The scream came. The bayonets caught starlight, and the Brownings opened on their preset traverse stops, and the mortars dropped on their pre-registered concentrations, and the canister rounds swept down the long axis of a column packed shoulder to shoulder on a sandbar that offered no cover and no defilade, nothing except backward, through the same coconut grove the mortars had already bracketed. The math did not care about Bushido or the charging scream. It cared about range cards and traverse limits and beaten zones measured in meters, and every number on every card had been verified that afternoon by a sergeant with a knotted cord. What happens when a doctrine fails and nobody updates it? 3 weeks after the sandbar, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi landed on Guadalcanal with 6,000 men, roughly 6 times the force Ichiki had thrown away. Kawaguchi possessed something Ichiki never had: a survivor's account of what went wrong. Fragmentary reports from the Ichiki detachment's remnants had filtered back through Rabaul, describing American defensive fire of extraordinary density and coordination. Kawaguchi read these reports. He acknowledged them. Then he designed an attack plan that repeated the same fundamental error on a larger scale, against a position the Marines had spent 3 weeks fortifying. The target shifted from Alligator Creek to a grassy ridge south of Henderson Field that ran roughly 1,000 yards along a north-south axis. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson commanded the defense, 1st Marine Raider Battalion reinforced by the 1st Parachute Battalion. Roughly 800 Marines total dug into positions along the ridge's spine. Edson operated from the same doctrinal playbook Pollock had used at the Tanaru, pre-registered mortar concentrations, interlocking machine gun positions with range cards, final protective fires plotted on the ridge's forward slopes, and fallback positions wired with communication lines behind them. Artillery from the 11th Marines, 105 mm howitzers positioned north of the airfield, held pre-registered concentrations on every approach route intelligence could identify. Edson's communications sergeant ran telephone wire from every company position back to the battalion command post, and from the command post to the artillery fire direction center. The wire mattered more than the guns. It meant Edson could call artillery onto a specific grid square within 90 seconds of a Japanese penetration, day or night, without seeing the target himself. Kawaguchi's plan called for 3 battalions to attack simultaneously from the south, converging on the ridge through dense jungle. The approach march alone consumed 2 days and broke the formation into disconnected columns that lost contact with each other in vegetation so thick that point men navigated by compass bearing. By the evening of September 12th, Kawaguchi's battalions occupied jump-off positions that bore little resemblance to their planned locations. One battalion sat 400 meters east of where Kawaguchi believed it to be. Communication between units relied on runners who took 45 minutes to cover distances. A radio signal crosses instantaneously, except Kawaguchi's radios had been damaged during the approach march through swamp and creek bed. So runners, it stayed. The attack hit Edson's Ridge at 0900 on the night of September 12th. Kawaguchi's lead battalion emerged from the jungle screaming, bayonets fixed, charging uphill across open grass toward Marine positions they could not see. The Brownings opened at 200 yards. Edson's mortars dropped illumination, and the ridge lit white, and the Japanese kept coming, wave after wave, up a slope that funneled them into the same killing geometry Pollock had built at the Tanaru, but stretched across a wider frontage with heavier supporting arms. The 105 howitzers fired their pre-registered concentrations into the jungle behind the assault waves, sealing the route of retreat with high-explosive fragmentation that burst at treetop level and drove steel fragments downward through the canopy. The first night cost Kawaguchi roughly 600 dead. He attacked again on September 13th. Edson pulled his Marines back to a tighter perimeter on the ridge's northern knob, a deliberate withdrawal that shortened his lines and concentrated his automatic weapons into a denser band. Kawaguchi interpreted the withdrawal as the beginning of collapse. His after-action report, captured months later, used language that revealed how completely the IJA night attack doctrine still governed his thinking. He described the Marine pullback as evidence that enemy morale had begun to crack under repeated assault. The opposite had occurred. Edson contracted his perimeter because a shorter line meant more Brownings per meter of frontage, more overlapping fields, a tighter mathematical surface of the kind Pollock's sergeant had measured with a knotted cord 3 weeks earlier. The second night produced fighting so intense that individual Marine positions changed hands multiple times. Japanese infantry reached the ridge crest in several places. Hand-to-hand combat erupted around Edson's command post. A platoon sergeant named Mitchell Page, technically at the Matanikau action a month later, though often conflated with this ridge in popular accounts, represented the type of Marine NCO the Japanese kept encountering and could not explain. Men who stayed on their guns after their crews died, firing Brownings from the hip during counterattacks, treating the night assault not as a terrifying anomaly, but as the specific scenario they had trained for. The records conflict on certain details of individual actions along the ridge that night. What remains unambiguous in every source is the outcome. Kawaguchi lost roughly 1,200 killed across both nights. his brigade retreated into the jungle so shattered that hundreds of soldiers died during the withdrawal from wounds, starvation, and disease. The Marines on Edson's Ridge lost 59 dead. The ratio, roughly 20-1, exceeded even the Tenaru's lopsided arithmetic, and the cause remained identical. Pre-registered fires, executed by disciplined crews who did not abandon their positions when Japanese infantry closed to bayonet range. American defensive doctrine at night functioned as a system, not a gamble. The Tenaru proved it once. Edson's Ridge proved it again, with 6 times the attacking force against a prepared defense that had refined every technique Pollock pioneered. Kawaguchi survived to file his report. Ichiki had not. And somewhere in the chain of reports flowing back to 17th Army headquarters at Rabaul, a company-grade officer attached to Kawaguchi's staff wrote an assessment of American night defensive capability that his superiors found intolerable, not because it lacked accuracy, but because accuracy threatened the single assumption the entire IJA offensive doctrine on Guadalcanal required to function. Captain Tadashi Suzuki, the name appears in 17th Army personnel records, but vanishes from operational documents after October 1942, sat in a bamboo-framed shelter at Tassafaronga, composing a report that would end his career as a combat officer. Rain hammered the palm-thatched roof. His hand shook, though whether from malaria or from what he had watched on Edson's Ridge 3 weeks earlier, the records do not say. Suzuki had served as a liaison between Kawaguchi's brigade staff and the 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry Regiment, meaning he observed both nights of the assault from a position close enough to the ridge to smell the cordite, but far enough behind the assault waves to survive them. His report ran 11 pages. The key passage, translated in a captured document summary compiled by the 1st Marine Division's Intelligence Section in late 1942, contained a single observation that detonated inside the IJA command structure like a grenade dropped into a foxhole. Suzuki wrote that American defensive fire at night operated as a coordinated mechanical system that did not degrade when visibility reached zero. He noted that Marine machine guns fired on fixed lines that never shifted in response to the attacking formation's movement. Evidence, he concluded, of pre-registered fields plotted before the engagement began. He described mortar fire that walked through the jungle assembly areas with a regularity suggesting pre-planned concentrations rather than observed adjustment. And then he wrote the sentence that finished him. The Marine Division Intelligence Summary paraphrases it. The enemy does not rely on individual courage or visual acquisition to maintain defensive cohesion at night. Their system removes the human element from the engagement. Night attack doctrine as currently practiced provides no advantage against this method and results only in the destruction of the attacking force. That last clause, results only in the destruction of the attacking force, negated everything the IJA had built its offensive playbook around since Manchuria. Suzuki did not frame his assessment as opinion. He framed it as mechanical observation, the way an engineer describes a bridge load rating. The American system bore weight the IJA's doctrine could not generate. More men and more bayonets would not change the math. The bridge would hold. Kawaguchi endorsed a version of the report, a softer version, stripped of Suzuki's bluntest conclusions, refocused on logistical failures and communication breakdowns during the approach march. Kawaguchi knew what candor cost. He had watched Lieutenant General Hyakutake's staff at 17th Army Headquarters dismiss the Ichiki detachment's annihilation as a consequence of Ichiki's recklessness rather than American defensive capability. The institutional logic ran like a closed circuit. If the doctrine remained sound, then failure meant the officer executing it had failed. Ichiki attacked with insufficient force and poor reconnaissance. Kawaguchi's approach march lost coordination in the jungle. The Americans got lucky with their positioning. Each explanation preserved the core assumption. The Americans could not fight at night. They had not fought at night. They had merely occupied ground that the attacking force failed to reach in proper order due to leadership errors. Suzuki's report broke that circuit because it described what happened after the Japanese infantry reached the Marine lines, and what happened contradicted the doctrine at the point of contact, not during the approach. Marines stayed on their guns. They did not flee. They fired on fixed lines that darkness could not disrupt. Suzuki had watched men charge directly into interlocking machine gun fire for 2 consecutive nights and observed that the volume of fire never decreased and never shifted in a way that suggested panic or confusion among the defenders. The Americans fought at night the way other armies fought in daylight. Better, actually, because their system eliminated the targeting errors that daylight sometimes introduced. 17th Army Headquarters received Kawaguchi's sanitized report in early October. Suzuki's unedited version arrived separately through a signals intelligence channel, probably hand-carried by a staff officer returning to Rabaul, though the routing remains unclear. Within weeks, Kawaguchi himself lost command of his brigade. Hyakutake's staff cited the failure at the ridge and Kawaguchi's inability to coordinate his battalions during the approach. The personnel action against Suzuki came faster and quieter. He received transfer orders to a garrison posting in the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein, according to one fragment in the 17th Army personnel log. A combat command reassigned to an atoll garrison. In the IJA's hierarchy of professional humiliation, the message required no explanation. The pattern repeated with variations that grew darker as Guadalcanal consumed Japanese infantry by the thousands. Colonel Akinosuke Oka's flanking attack during the same September offensive had failed for different tactical reasons. His battalions arrived late and attacked piecemeal, but officers in Oka's command who attributed the failure to American defensive methods rather than Japanese execution errors found their assessments edited or shelved, sometimes returned with marginal notes questioning their fighting spirit. A major on Hyakutake's own staff, whose name survives only as a surname initial in a post-war interrogation transcript, Major K, reportedly drafted a memorandum in November 1942 recommending that night assault tactics against prepared American positions be replaced with siege approaches and sapping operations. The interrogation transcript notes that Major K received a verbal reprimand and reassignment to a supply depot on New Britain. His memorandum does not appear in surviving 17th Army files. The IJA did not lack intelligent officers capable of reading a battlefield. It lacked an institutional mechanism for allowing battlefield evidence to override doctrinal orthodoxy. Suzuki saw the system. Major K saw the system. Kawaguchi, in his private assessment, almost certainly saw the system. Each man who reported what he saw discovered that the IJA treated accurate intelligence about American capability the same way it treated the American defensive line itself, as something to be charged through rather than understood. A single brass casing from a 105mm howitzer round weighs roughly 14 pounds empty. After the October offensive, Hyakutake's personal attempt, the third major assault on the Henderson Field perimeter, Marines policing the gun pits of the 11th Marines found brass stacked waist-high around each howitzer position, cascading downhill in copper-colored drifts that clinked underfoot like loose gravel. The smell hung in the air for days afterward. A metallic tang cut with burnt propellant that coated the inside of the nose and stayed there through meals and sleep. Gunners who had fired continuously through the night of October 25th reported burns on their forearms from brushing against breech mechanisms too hot to touch with bare skin. 11,000 rounds. That figure appears in the 11th Marines after-action report for the 2-night period covering October 24th and 25th, 1942. 11,000 artillery shells fired in defense of the Henderson Field perimeter during what the official histories call the Battle for Henderson Field, and what the Marines who fought it called the Night Hyakutake sent the Sendai Division to die. Break the number down. The 11th Marines fielded 3 battalions of artillery, a mix of 105mm howitzers and 75mm pack howitzers, roughly 36 tubes total. 11,000 rounds across 36 guns over roughly 14 hours of darkness means each tube averaged 305 rounds in a single night. A 105 crew firing at sustained rate produces roughly 3 rounds per minute. 305 rounds means each crew fired for roughly 100 minutes of the 14-hour darkness, not continuously, but in concentrated bursts timed to the Japanese assault waves, with the Fire Direction Center shifting concentrations across the perimeter as reports came in by wire from infantry battalion command posts. The weight of metal those 36 tubes threw into the jungle south of Henderson Field, across both nights, exceeded 230 tons of high explosive steel. 230 tons, dropped into an area roughly 1,500 meters wide and 800 meters deep. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama commanded the Sendai Division, the 2nd Division, one of the IJA's premier formations, veterans of Java and the Philippines, soldiers who considered themselves the finest infantry in the Imperial Army. Maruyama divided his force into 2 wings and sent them through the same jungle that had swallowed Kawaguchi's coordination a month earlier. Just as Kawaguchi's battalions had lost contact in the vegetation, so too Maruyama's wings arrived at the perimeter hours apart, attacking sequentially rather than simultaneously, feeding battalions into the American fire plan one at a time instead of overwhelming it with mass. The jungle imposed the same penalty on the Sendai Division that it had imposed on Kawaguchi's brigade. Nobody at 17th Army headquarters adjusted for it. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines held the southern sector. Puller's defensive preparation followed the template that by now functioned as institutional memory on Guadalcanal. Range cards, final protective lines, pre-registered mortar and artillery concentrations, telephone wire running from every company position to the battalion command post and from the command post to the Fire Direction Center. The system Suzuki had described as coordinated mechanical had grown more lethal with each iteration. Puller's Marines had a month more digging time than Edson's Raiders. They had more wire, more ammunition, more registered concentrations. The 11th Marines had refined their fire direction procedures to the point where a single telephone call could shift a battery's fire to a new concentration in under 60 seconds. The Sendai Division hit Puller's line after midnight. The jungle erupted with the sound of 7,000 men crashing through undergrowth, officers blowing whistles, NCOs screaming commands, and then the Brownings opened and the howitzers fired, and the mathematical surface that Sergeant Gruenwald had first measured with a knotted cord 2 months earlier expanded to its fullest expression. An entire divisional perimeter backed by massed artillery, operating under centralized fire direction, with pre-plotted concentrations on every approach route, scaled beyond anything the sandbar or the grassy ridge had demanded. The shells burst at treetop height. White-hot fragments scythed downward through canopy and men alike, shredding formations that had already lost cohesion in the dark. Japanese soldiers who survived the artillery emerged from the tree line into machine gun fire, so dense that bodies stacked 3 deep in front of individual Marine fighting positions. Maruyama lost roughly 3,500 killed across both nights. His division ceased to exist as an offensive force. Survivors retreated westward along jungle trails so narrow that the wounded could not be carried, and hundreds died where they collapsed. Marine casualties on Puller's sector totaled fewer than 100 dead. The ratio held, roughly 35-1 in places, never worse than 20-1 across the entire perimeter. 3 major assaults had now produced 3 catastrophic failures, and the cause had never changed. The American night defense on Guadalcanal consumed Japanese infantry at a rate the IJA's replacement pipeline could not sustain. 17th Army committed the equivalent of an entire division's worth of casualties in night attacks between August and October, roughly 7,000 killed in 3 major assaults against positions that never broke. Each assault demonstrated the same mechanical truth Suzuki had identified and been punished for stating. The American system did not depend on courage, though courage held the line when Japanese infantry reached the foxholes. It depended on mathematics, registered fires, interlocking bands, coordinated artillery, telephone wire, fire direction centers, an industrial product assembled from American training doctrine, American communications equipment, American ammunition supply, and American NCOs who stayed on their guns because the system told them exactly where every round would land, and they believed it. 11,000 shells per night meant the jungle itself became the weapon. The Japanese charged Spirit against systemized violence delivered at industrial scale, and Spirit lost every single time. What did the IJA actually learn? The honest answer is, the institution learned nothing. Individual officers learned everything. The gap between those two facts killed thousands of men. 17th Army's operational summary for the Guadalcanal campaign, compiled in early 1943 after the evacuation, attributed the failure of night assaults to insufficient reconnaissance, poor coordination during approach marches, and inadequate logistical preparation. The phrase American defensive capability appears exactly once in the 63-page document, in a subordinate clause describing terrain advantages the Marines exploited. The summary recommends better radios, better maps, and more thorough rehearsal of approach routes. It does not recommend abandoning night assault doctrine. It does not mention pre-registered fires, interlocking machine gun bands, fire direction centers, or telephone wire. The American system that killed 7,000 Japanese soldiers in 3 months occupies less space in the official after-action report than the section on ration spoilage during supply runs from Rabaul. But the captured documents tell a different story. The 1st Marine Division's intelligence section, operating out of a tent complex near Henderson Field through late 1942, processed over 400 captured Japanese documents during the campaign. Diaries, orders, reports, personal letters, maps with marginal annotations. A pattern emerged in the company and battalion-level reports that never appeared in the division or army-level summaries above them. Junior officers described American night defense with technical precision that increased in sophistication as the campaign progressed. An unnamed lieutenant in the Sendai Division's 29th Infantry Regiment wrote in his field diary that Marine machine guns fire on lines that do not move even when we move, the exact observation Suzuki had formalized weeks earlier. A company commander in the same regiment noted that American mortar fire arrived in his assembly area before his men began their assault, meaning the Americans had plotted concentrations on ground the Japanese had not yet occupied in strength. He drew the correct conclusion. The mortars fired on pre-planned targets, not observed ones. Darkness gave his company no concealment because the Americans did not need to see them. These observations accumulated in Marine intelligence files. They did not accumulate in IJA doctrine. The British had encountered something structurally similar in 1915 and 1916 on the Western Front, junior officers filing accurate assessments of German defensive methods that senior commanders dismissed because the assessments contradicted the prevailing theory of breakthrough. The parallel runs close enough to sting. Colonel Gruenwald, the same sergeant who had crawled the west bank of Alligator Creek with a knotted cord in August, now promoted after Guadalcanal, eventually reaching full colonel by the end of the war, gave a lecture at Quantico in 1946 on the evolution of Marine night defensive doctrine. The lecture transcript survives in the Marine Corps University archives. Gruenwald devoted 11 pages to the technical system. Range cards, final protective lines, pre-registered artillery concentrations, wire communications, fire direction center procedures. Then he spent 2 pages on a subject the technical manual never covered. He talked about trust. The system worked, Gruenwald said, because every Marine on the line believed that the guns behind him would fire where the range cards said they would fire, at the time the fire plan said they would fire, regardless of what was happening in the dark 50 yards to his front. The private on the Browning did not need to see the Japanese soldier charging at him. He needed to trust that his gun fired on a line that intersected the beaten zone of the Browning 30 yards to his left, and that the mortars behind him would drop illumination when the telephone wire carried the request, and that the 105 batteries 1,000 yards north would put steel on the pre-registered concentration his company commander called for. Each link in the chain held because every man in the chain had rehearsed his role until the sequence ran without thought. Darkness could not disrupt a process that never relied on sight. Gruenwald mentioned Suzuki's report, not by name. He referred to a captured Japanese staff assessment that described our defensive fires as a mechanical system. Gruenwald called it the most accurate description of Marine night defense he had ever read, including American descriptions. The enemy understood the system better than most of the men who built it, because the enemy experienced it from the receiving end and had professional training sufficient to analyze what he experienced. Suzuki saw the machine from the outside. Gruenwald built it from the inside. They arrived at identical conclusions. Kwajalein fell to the 4th Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division on February 4, 1944. The assault lasted 4 days. American casualties ran heavy by Central Pacific standards, roughly 1,000 killed and wounded. Japanese losses approached total annihilation. Over 4,800 of the roughly 5,000 defenders killed. The bombardment that preceded the landing delivered more naval and air ordnance per square yard than any Pacific operation to that date. The garrison personnel records for Kwajalein in early 1944 do not survive intact. Most burned during the pre-invasion bombardment or were destroyed by the garrison commander in the final hours. Suzuki's name does not appear in the fragmentary roster recovered by American intelligence teams after the island's capture. It does not appear in the prisoner lists either. Only 49 Japanese soldiers survived to be captured on Kwajalein, and none of the surviving interrogation transcripts mention a Captain Tadashi Suzuki. The bombardment could have killed him. A transfer could have moved him before the assault. He could have been among the 49 and given a different name. Somewhere in the 17th Army's filing system, an 11-page report described exactly why night attacks against American positions would fail. The officer who wrote it received a transfer to a coral atoll 1,200 miles from the nearest combat command. 14 months later, the 4th Marine Division landed on that atoll, and a signals officer in the division intelligence section began sorting through waterlogged Japanese documents pulled from a shattered concrete bunker.